When I grew up in the 1940s in North Florida, it was a pretty wild place, and I tromped through the woods and the swamps and the creeks with my cousins, so I know the people who live there. And I wrote a little story about a crazy girl named Junebug. So I'm going to read you that story and see what you think. It's called Junebug Up the Creek with a Paddle. Junebug was standing on the end of the dock wearing a pair of ragged cut-off jeans and a little tiny red checkered shirt with the tail ends tied in a knot under her ample bosom when Ralph Earl came walking up. She had her hands on her hips and sass written all over her freckled face. Ralph Earl grinned from ear to ear and said, "Looks to me like you're up Shit Creek without a paddle." Then he busted out laughing. She was 16 years old that day and stood every bit of 5 feet tall. Junebug stamped her left foot and said, "You know what, Ralph Earl? You're dumber than a brick. One of them bricks my granddaddy made out of cow patties and dried up corn shucks." Then she picked up the paddle out of the skiff tied to the dock and shook it in his face. "You see this paddle, dumb shit?" "Sure I do. I ain't blind," Ralph Earl said. "Well, that's the first smart thing you've said. What you gonna what's gonna happen if I slap you upside the head with it?" Junebug asked. "You ain't gonna do that nohow," Ralph Earl answered. He stepped back 3 steps and nearly fell off the dock. "I'm gonna whack you right on top of your head with it. That's what's gonna happen. Your brains, oh wait, your brain. You ain't got enough to call 'em brains. Your tiny little brain is gonna splatter all over the creek, and them catfish are gonna rush right up to the top and gobble it up. Only trouble is they'll starve slam to death trying to get a meal. So I'm thinking you best be getting your skinny self on back home before I lose all control of my control." Ralph Earl turned and ran as fast as his size 12 feet could carry him. He didn't stop till he got inside his own front door and slammed it and shut it behind him. He locked and bolted that door and propped his grandpa's cowhide chair under the latch for double protection. Junebug was crazy, and he knew it. Trouble was, he didn't know just how crazy she could get. Not yet, he didn't. But he didn't have long to wait. Ralph Earl got up before daylight the next morning and started off down the creek to catch a mess of brim for breakfast. He tied up to a tall cypress knee poking out of the cold creek water about 10 feet from the bank. The water had that nice amber color it gets when it runs through a bunch of red and purple leaves upstream. It makes a kind of tea color, but it's still clear enough to see the fish, at least till the water gets too deep. Ralph Earl could see the little fish swimming all around the cypress knee, so he was sure the granddaddy fish had to be there somewhere. He reached in the worm can and plucked out the biggest earthworm he'd ever seen. That thing must have been 6 inches long, looked more like a snake than a worm. Ralph Earl threaded that slimy worm onto his hook with skill. He ought to be skilled. He'd been baiting his own hook since he was 3 years old. Ever since his pappy died, he'd been responsible for feeding his family, and he was doing a pretty fair job of it so far. He could catch nearly anything that swam in that old creek, and he was a crack shot. It was rabbit one day, squirrels the next, then on a good day it was a turkey gobbler. And once in a while a big buck, the Washburn family's version of steak. Ralph Earl had 3 little sisters, and they loved fresh caught brim and biscuits with honey for breakfast. That's what he was trying to do that morning before the sun got to the treetops. You see, those little sisters were the stars in his sky. He was 6 years old when the first one was born. He thought she was about the prettiest thing in the world when his mama brought her home. His pappy was a no-count, though, even then. But he was still pappy. Pappy got drunk the first night little Becky was home, drunker than Cooter Brown. Ralph Earl tried his best to talk Pappy out of drinking that last jug, but it didn't matter. Didn't make no never mind to him, not a bit. He passed out on the dock before daylight with that little baby girl crying her lungs out up in the cabin. He probably just slam forgot he had a baby girl. Anyway, from that day on, Ralph Earl knew what he had to do, and he'd been doing it ever since. He went to school for a while, but it got to be too hard to be the man of the house and do learning on the side, so he gave up the learning mostly altogether. He made sure his little sisters didn't, though. He cooked them breakfast every morning and tied bows in their hair and put them on the school bus before he put into making what he could to support the family. He cut firewood and hauled it to the rich folks up on the hill, and he checked the trot lines and dressed the catfish he'd caught the night before, then delivered them to the cafe before he wandered off down into the swamp to see what kind of meat he could bring home. It wasn't an altogether bad life, but it wasn't exactly easy either. Junebug was the bright spot in his day. She had the reddest hair he'd ever seen, and he loved red hair. He was convinced Cleopatra had red hair. He got in trouble one day when his teacher told the class Cleo was Egyptian, and so she had black hair. Ralph Earl insisted she had red hair, much to the teacher's dismay. He didn't win that battle, but he didn't change his mind either. Cleo still had red hair. Junebug was a year younger, so she wasn't in that class, but the teacher knew her. Ralph Earl wondered why the teacher laughed at him when he kept insisting Cleopatra had red hair. Junebug always seemed to know when Ralph Earl needed her. She showed up one Sunday morning when Ralph Earl was trying to get his little sisters ready for church, and one of them couldn't find her shoe. His mother had gone off to work in town, so she always told him to get those girls to Sunday school on time. So he was doing his best. Junebug heard the squalling as soon as she opened the front gate. She bounded up the steps and hollered, "What's all that ballyhoo about?" Ralph Earl poked his head out the screen door with a grin and said, "Sally's lost her shoe again. We can't find it anywhere." Junebug looked around and spied it immediately, of course. It was lodged in the flower pot on the front porch, the pot that used to have a red geranium in it. She picked up the shoe and tossed it to Ralph Earl. "Ask her if she thought it was going to sprout shoe flowers. She must have chunked it off when she walked up the porch last Sunday." "Sally Ann, get this shoe on your foot and pay attention to where you put it next time when you take it off." "Thanks, Junebug," Ralph Earl said. "Any time. Any chance you'd skip Sunday school and go fishing this fine morning?" asked Junebug. "You know Mama won't let me do that, Junebug." "You can come along with us, though," said Ralph Earl. "Nope, not going to happen, Ralph Earl. You know that," replied Junebug. Ralph Earl laughed as he thought about that day. Maybe it was the day he figured it out. He decided right then and there he was going to marry that red-haired girl one way or another. And it was looking like it might have to be the other. He'd already tried one way. He'd come right out and ask her the day she turned 15, but that didn't come to much. She just laughed at him. It took a while to get over that, but he did, mostly. He wasn't one to give up easy, though. He was still thinking about that day when it happened. Ralph Earl snagged the granddaddy of all brim. Not that granddaddy brim was all that big, but it gave him a fight for sure. His pole nearly doubled over as that monster brim zigzagged back and forth, zipping the line right through the water with a zing. Ralph Earl worked that line till he got it right up to the boat, then wham! Something snatched that fish right out of his hand. He was reaching down to pluck the fish out of the water when the monster caught it. Then it happened. The skiff reared up on the port side and dunked Ralph Earl right in the water on top of the monster. It was on him before he could react. It was the biggest gator he ever saw. And he was eyeball to eyeball when all of a sudden, bam! And that big mess of blood and guts was rolling in the water about to drown him. The monster's tail flipped him upside the head and knocked him clean out of the water nearly to the bank. That's when he saw Red. She was standing over him holding that old rifle her granddaddy gave her when she was turned 12 years old. Ralph Earl figured out in a hurry what had happened. "You could have killed me, you crazy woman," he shouted. "Well, maybe I should have let old Ned kill you instead. You do realize you were about to be dinner, don't you, you dumbass?" Junebug said. "But you could have killed me," Ralph Earl shouted. "But I didn't," said Junebug. She looked at him with one eyebrow raised. It was that look she had then she turned around and stomped back up the hill. Ralph Earl jumped out of the water and grabbed her from behind. He took her face in his hands and kissed her square on the lips. She tasted a little bit like blood. Then he realized he had gator blood on his face. He wiped his face with his sleeve when Junebug came up for air. Junebug grinned and said, "Just you wait a minute, Buster." She walked 3 long steps to the big magnolia tree and carefully propped the rifle against the tree and walked slowly back. Ralph Earl was standing there, bloody mess, the gator brains spattered all over his shirt. Old Ned, being cold-blooded varmint he was still squirming at the edge of the water. Ralph Earl waited. Junebug walked right up to him and put both arms around him, then plastered her face against his. When he finally regained his senses, Ralph Earl said, "Guess this means we'll have to get married now." "Guess so," said Junebug. And that's the end of the story. Hope you enjoyed it.